Hey everyone, so we are the Explaining Bias with Music team. This is Dina, Steffi, and Andrew, and myself, Jonathan. And one of the things that we really enjoyed about this course was that it gave us tools and stories to understand the way that bias is inherent in the algorithms and computer technologies that we use every day. And I want to define bias quickly as something that causes a machine learning model to produce outcomes that are not desired. And this is a very broad definition, and this was something that we learned in the class, is that there's a lot of different ways that people interpret things like artificial intelligence or bias in machine learning, or the ways that we understand how models are built and used. And so part of our project was to break that down into very specific subcategories of the model development pipeline, from collecting the data all the way to training the model and then using it, so that people can understand where bias enters the machine learning model development pipeline at every step of the way, and how at each part different changes can be made that can help us to improve the outcomes of our models so that they're less harmful to people and so that they better represent the tasks that we're trying to accomplish with them. There's two examples I want to give you quickly. One of them, facial recognition, of how bias comes into it. This was something that some of the books that we were reading and Mimi in her talks shared with us, and as you've heard from the last group as they explained it a little bit. A study by Joy Buolawomi, she looked at how dark-skinned versus light-skinned people have different results on facial recognition data sets, where light-skinned people were getting like much higher accuracy rates because they were much higher representation in the data sets. So I think like in the one data set she looked at, 80% of the photos were of people with light skin, which has significant implications if you think about China's recent social credit system and how they're using facial recognition for that. And on the right, you see the results of a recidivism program that looked at people that were going to be incarcerated and how likely it was that they would return to jail again after being released. And this study by ProRepublica found that it was twice as likely to misclassify white males who are getting much lower scores for recidivism. So it thought that they were much less likely to return to prison, even though they were equally likely to return to prison. And so these kinds of things have big results because then the judges were using them to decide how long sentences should be, and people were receiving less heavy sentences despite the fact that the data showed they were just as likely to return to prison. And this is something we don't want to see in our society. However, that can be hard to relate to for people who maybe aren't in the judicial system or have other things. So we wanted to pick something that we could build a model around and go through the process of collecting the data and training the model and seeing how the different biases played into that. And so we picked music.
So when we were picking music, we wanted to relate to the day-to-day life so it can be understood by the average Joe. So we picked a specifically music recommendation. How do you get your music recommendation on your day-to-day life, whatever platform you're using? So to do that, we looked at the popular music recommendations, whether it was YouTube Music, Spotify, or Apple Music. They're kind of the big names in the game right now. So to do that, we actually ended up choosing Spotify because it had like a Spotify API, and we were able to do a developer account, and we were able to dive more into the algorithm of it. So a big thing that you might not recognize is most of these platforms are advertising a lot of music because that's the catch on, look how much music we have. But a big part of it is actually, for something like Spotify, 20% of the songs in the database have never been heard before. So this is like one of them right here. So Forgetify is a website that pulls all of the songs that have never been heard before on Spotify and gives you a listen to it. Now, I do understand why some of them were never listened to or played before. But in the same time, it puts stuff in perspective, like stuff like these, or like these tracks have never been in the recommendation systems or have never been seeked out by people before.
So this brings us to a framework for how do we look at bias within machine learning and algorithms. So one way is in the first stage, which is data generation. So how are you getting data from the real world into a physical model and your digital data that you can handle? And then the second is how are you building this model and then using that and implementing it. So the first bias of 5 is historical bias. So this occurs during the data generation portion, and this is when the model represents the world as it is or historically was, and this can lead to undesired outcomes if we have biases in society. The second one is a representation bias, which occurs during the population selection for our group. And if a group is underrepresented from our input space, then this can lead to a representation bias. Third, we have a measurement bias. So this occurs during the transition from getting your real world information to a certain data point. So with this, if you only have partial information of your problem, such as how danceable is the song, then you can have a measurement bias because you're not fully representing it. Then it brings us to aggregation bias, which occurs during the model generation and training. So when a model works for the majority of the group, but not a minority, then that is a result of aggregation bias. And lastly, we have evaluation bias. So when you're testing and evaluating your model, the method for the evaluation can result in a misrepresentation of how it's intended to perform. So if you have a poor evaluation model, then it could not perform as well as it should with its intended users.
So I think that I hope that with our project we were able to transmit a bit of how there are several reasons of why there can be bias. As in, of course, the first and most obvious reason of why there exists biased algorithms is because of who we are as people. But I hope that we were able to transmit that there are several ways of how we can try to mitigate the negative effects. But while working this project, we noticed how hard it is to notice biases when you're looking for them and not directly affected by them. We often had assumptions of, oh, when we'll look for this, we will find a problem or we'll find a gap. And we noticed that Spotify very often had already controlled for the problems we assumed we would find. So I think that was an interesting part of the project for us. We also noticed how hard it can be to explain very difficult concepts to people who are not part of the experts. Explaining a machine learning algorithm without using the math can be pretty difficult, not as if I could do it, but some people in my team could. And I think this course was very interesting to help to allow people from very different backgrounds to work together, and I think our project was really interesting. The beginning, you had to spend way more time in trying to communicate with each other, just knowing how will I even talk to this other person. But then we ended up with a project where everybody collaborated and everyone had some say in the project. So listening to all these unlistened music or talking about danceability of a song really helped us lessen the tension sometimes. Music was a very interesting medium to use. So I thank you all for the support we've received and a very wonderful platform to meet new people. Thank you.